I came into Red Hollow on a day when the sun had decided to lay its full weight on the world. Heat was coming off the ground in waves, turning the air into something you could almost see. The boards of the storefronts were split and dry, as if the town itself had been left too long in the fire. Horses stood with their heads low, tails flicking slow, eyes dull. The flies were bolder than the people, thick around the butcher's shop windows where meat hung in the heat. I'd been to town in weather like this before, but I never saw it so still. No one lingered outside unless they had to. I wasn't in any hurry either. Just needed flour, beans, maybe some seed if the price wasn't too high. I passed the livery and gave a nod to the stable hand, slid down from my mule, and stood a moment in the dust. It was the kind of day that made you question whether the thing you came for was worth it. I was tying my mule when I noticed something across the way. At first, I thought it was nothing more than a post left leaning in the sun. Then the shape shifted a little, and I saw him, a boy, roped there like a calf at auction. Barefoot, ankles caked in dust, a shirt hanging off one shoulder. His hair was plastered to his face, his lips cracked, his ribs showing under the fabric in colors no ribs should be. I'd seen yellow like that before, the tail end of a bruise when the pain's still fresh, but the body's trying to heal. He wasn't crying, wasn't begging, just leaning a shoulder against the post like his legs didn't trust him. He looked like he might have been 15, though it's hard to tell when someone's been starved of more than just food. A couple of men in front of the saloon laughed at something I didn't hear. My eyes went to the rope at his chest, the knot biting into his skin. No one in that street was paying him much mind, and those who saw him didn't seem surprised. That's the kind of place Red Hollow can be. I stood there longer than I meant to, breathing through my nose, trying to decide if I was seeing what I thought I was. I could have walked away, told myself it was none of my business, but I've buried my share of regrets, and I know the weight of one more. I crossed the street and pushed through the saloon doors. Inside, the air was hotter still. A piano sat broken in the corner, keys gone like teeth pulled by a bad hand. The man behind the bar was Rusk. I knew him by reputation. The kind of man who'd sell anything if the price was right and call it a fair deal. His shirt was open at the belly, and he was wiping a glass with a rag that looked dirtier than the glass itself. "Morning," he said, though his voice didn't mean it. I didn't bother to return it. My eyes swept the room, catching the gamblers, the flies, the mirror cracked into a dozen versions of a face no one wanted to see. Then I said, "That boy outside, how much?" He gave a short laugh. "Ain't for sale. Belongs to me now. Part of a debt. He's not livestock." "Lady," he said, leaning on the bar, "if you're getting soft about strays, maybe buy a dog. Boy's here to work. Or be worked." I stepped closer. "Name your price." He looked me over the way men do when they think they've got the upper hand. "You got coin?" I dropped my purse on the counter. He peered inside, snorted. "Not enough." I didn't flinch. My hand went into my coat, and I pulled out a small silver brooch. The clasp was worn smooth, and inside, folded behind the pin, was a strand of my boy's hair. I hadn't touched it in years. My fingers were steady when I set it next to the coins. Rusk stared at it, then at me. "You sure?" I nodded once. "Take him. Don't come crying when he won't talk." I didn't answer, just picked up my sack of supplies and stepped back into the sun. The boy didn't look up when I untied him. His eyes were glazed with heat and something heavier. I pressed a canteen into his hands. He drank a little, coughed, and stopped. "Can you walk?" I asked. A small nod. I took the mule's reins and started north. The boy followed, his arms tucked in like he was trying to take up less space than he already did. We didn't speak. No one stopped us. No one asked what had just happened. In Red Hollow, the world kept turning whether you set something right or left it wrong. But for the two of us, one used up, the other half broken, the ground had just shifted. If you're listening to this and it stirs something in you, if you've ever seen a wrong that needed a steady hand to put it right, then I'd ask you, like this story, leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the rest. There's more to tell. And sometimes the smallest choice made in the heat of a day like that one can change everything. Rusk had that smirk people wear when they think they've already won, the kind that makes you want to wipe it clean off their face. He leaned back against the bar like I was entertainment for the morning. "Not enough," he said again. tapping my little purse with one finger, as if to remind me he'd already decided what my coin was worth. I didn't bother arguing. I knew men like him. You don't reason with them, you make it cost them something they didn't expect to lose. My hand went into the inside pocket of my coat, and I felt the familiar shape before I saw it. The brooch was cool against my palm, its weight small but heavy in a way no gold could measure. Silver dulled with years, edges worn smooth from my fingers. Inside the clasp was a curl of blonde hair, tied with a bit of thread. My boy's hair, cut the summer he turned 6 before the fever took him. I hadn't opened it since the day I put it there. I set it on the counter beside the coins without looking at it, because if I looked too long, I might lose my nerve. The saloon had gone quieter, not because anyone cared about the boy outside, but because they could smell a deal turning. Rusk's eyes narrowed. "You sure about that?" His voice had lost some of its swagger. I met his gaze. "Take it. Give me the boy." My voice didn't shake, though my heart had started to thump in that slow, steady way it does before you do something you know you can't undo. He stared another second, then gave a grunt like the whole thing bored him. "He's yours. Don't come crying when he won't talk." I picked up my sack of supplies, turned without another word, and pushed through the doors into the blistering light. The boy was still there, head bowed like the sun was too much for him to lift against. His skin had that dry, thin look that says the body's running on whatever scraps it can steal from itself. I stepped close enough to untie the rope from the post, my fingers working quick because I didn't want Rusk changing his mind. I held out the canteen again, and this time his hands trembled when he took it. He drank slow, careful sips, then stopped like he wasn't sure if he'd be allowed the rest. "Can you walk?" I asked. His nod was barely more than a tilt of his chin, but it was enough. I took the mule's reins and started north, not looking back, trusting that he would follow. I didn't tell him where we were going, didn't tell him who I was. I'd learned long ago that trust isn't something you pour on a person. It's something they step into on their own. The sound of his footsteps stayed behind me, a steady, uncertain rhythm on the packed dirt. I kept my eyes ahead, but part of me was back at that counter, watching my hand set down the last thing I had left of my boy. It was strange. I didn't feel regret, not exactly. The brooch had been my proof that he'd been here, that I'd been a mother once. But this boy's shadow behind me, it felt like maybe proof could come in other shapes too. I knew what the men in that saloon thought, what the town would whisper if they cared enough to talk about it. A widow trading her son's keepsake for a stray boy no one wanted. It didn't make sense to people who'd never had something taken from them they couldn't get back. But I'd made my choice, and choices have a way of setting themselves like fence posts in hard ground. Once they're in, you don't pull them up without tearing something that matters. The heat pressed down heavier the further we got from town, and the road stretched ahead like it might never end. I thought about asking his name, but decided against it. There would be time for that later. Right now, he needed the quiet more than I needed the answer. Somewhere behind me, his steps faltered for just a moment before picking back up. I didn't turn. I'd learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can give someone is the dignity of not noticing when they're struggling. My hand tightened on the reins, and the mule flicked an ear back toward me. That little silver brooch was sitting on a bar in Red Hollow now, probably already in Rusk's pocket, but I could feel the absence of it in my coat like a missing tooth. I'd carried it for 5 years, and in less than 5 minutes it was gone. But the boy wasn't tied to that post anymore, and somehow that made the weight in my chest feel a little less sharp. We didn't speak for the rest of the walk, but his shadow stayed just close enough to touch mine if the sun shifted right. The road north from Red Hollow wasn't really a road, just a thin path beaten into the grass by hooves and wagon wheels that hadn't passed in weeks. The sun was still high enough to press heavy on our backs, and the land stretched open in every direction, wide and unforgiving. I walked beside my mule, letting the reins hang loose, her ears flicking at the buzz of flies. The boy followed 10 feet behind, his steps soft in the dirt, careful, like he didn't want to leave much of himself behind. I didn't turn to look at him. Not yet. Sometimes looking too soon makes a skittish thing bolt. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was the kind that happens when two people haven't earned the right to fill it yet. I thought about speaking, asking his name, telling him mine, but the thought passed. I'd seen this kind of quiet before, the kind that isn't just shyness, but the armor a person builds when words have been used against them. You don't take that apart with questions, you just walk alongside it until it doesn't feel the need to stand anymore. By late afternoon, the boy's steps started to falter. I heard the stumble before I saw it, the scrape of a boot on stone, the sharp intake of breath. He caught himself on his knees, stood again, without a word. The second time it happened, I stopped and pulled the strip of jerky from my coat pocket, holding it out without comment. He didn't take it. His eyes flicked to mine, then away, as if waiting for me to insist. I didn't. Instead, I unscrewed the canteen and passed it over. He drank just enough to wet his lips, then handed it back like he wasn't sure if he'd earned more. I slipped the jerky back into my pocket. We kept walking. We made camp that night under a crooked cottonwood by the creek. The air cooled quick once the sun dropped, though the heat still clung low to the ground. I didn't bother with a fire. No reason to draw eyes if there were any out here. Supper was cold beans from the tin and bread gone a little stiff, eaten in the quiet. I spread my blanket on the dirt and set another across from me, not close enough for our hands to reach, but close enough he'd know it was his if he wanted it. He didn't lie down right away. Just sat with his knees pulled tight to his chest, arms wrapped around them, like he could make himself smaller if he tried hard enough. When he finally stretched out, it was with his boots still on, shoulders stiff, eyes half open. I lay on my side and kept my breathing slow, but I didn't sleep much. My mind kept going back to the rope around his chest, the way his skin had looked where it rubbed him raw. Boys like him don't end up tied to a post by accident. Whatever story came before Red Hollow, I knew enough not to ask tonight. Sometimes not knowing right away is its own kind of kindness. Morning broke soft and pale, the kind of light that makes the land look gentler than it is. He was awake before me, standing by the mule, staring out over the creek as if he was measuring how far he could go. When I rolled my blanket, he stepped back toward the path without a word. I took the lead again, letting him follow at the same quiet distance. By midday, though, that distance had closed. Sometimes he was only a few steps behind, close enough I could hear the light drag of his boots in the dust. Once, when the mule startled at a jackrabbit, I saw his hand move quick to steady the reins without thinking about it. His hands were sure, natural, I noticed that. We reached the homestead by sundown. From the ridge, it probably didn't look like much, just a small cabin with a porch that creaked in every board, a roof in need of patching, and a chicken pen half fallen in on itself. The barn leaned like it had been holding its breath too long, but it was clean and it was mine. I watched him stand at the edge of the property, staring, his face unreadable. He didn't look relieved, more like he was waiting for someone to come out and tell him he didn't belong. I led the mule into the barn and he followed without being told, his steps cautious but steady. Inside, I showed him the hay, the water bucket, the pitchfork. "Morning starts early," and I said, handing him the lantern. He nodded once, his eyes moving over every corner as if committing it to memory. The cabin had 2 beds, narrow and clean, with a trunk between them. I pointed to the one near the window. "You'll sleep there." He sat down on the edge of the mattress, hands resting on his knees, not lying back. I stepped outside to wash my hands at the basin, giving him the space to settle in if he wanted. When I came back in, he was still sitting in the same position, staring at the wall. His boots stayed on through the night. As I lay in my own bed, I thought about how strange it was to hear another person breathing in the cabin again. It had been years since the air inside held more than my own size, and the faint groan of the boards in the wind. I didn't know yet what bringing this boy here would mean for either of us, but I knew this much. He wasn't out there tied to a post anymore, and for tonight, that was enough. The first morning, he was already outside when I stepped onto the porch, standing near the chicken pen with his head tilted, studying the broken gate like he was trying to understand how it had failed. I didn't call to him, I just handed him the hammer and pointed to the pile of nails without a word. He took them like it was an order, though I hadn't meant it that way. I left a clean shirt hanging over the porch rail, my boy's from before. It wasn't new, but it would fit. I didn't say whose it was, didn't tell him to wear it. I knew the moment, for that would be his to choose. In those first days, he moved around the place like someone learning the boundaries of a cage, quiet, deliberate, waiting to see if he'd be punished for stepping too far. He fetched water from the well without being asked, chopped a small pile of wood, pulled weeds from the garden bed. Not a word passed between us beyond the bare minimum. At night he sat on his bed, upright, boots still on, arms folded like he was bracing for something. I made enough supper for two and set it on the table without comment. Sometimes he finished it, sometimes he didn't. I noticed the way his eyes followed my hands when I worked, how he tensed if I moved too fast, how sharp noises seemed to pull him backward into himself. I'd seen horses like that, ones that had been whipped until the mere raise of a hand made them skitter. Patience wasn't kindness in those moments. It was survival. I told myself I'd offer what steadiness I could, and if that meant long stretches of silence, so be it. A few days in, I was pouring coffee at the stove when I said, without turning, "You're not a burden." The words hung there, heavy, waiting. For a long moment there was nothing. Then a voice dry as old wood, barely above a whisper, "I can fix the gate." I didn't turn. "Then fix it," I said. That was the first thing he'd chosen to say to me. After that, the words came in tiny measures, a yes here and I'll do it there. He didn't speak of his past, and I didn't ask. His body told enough of the story, shoulders drawn too tight, footsteps too light for a boy his age, eyes that measured every move I made. But little by little, I began to see shifts. He started washing his hands without being told. I'd find the tools hung back in the right place in the shed, the water bucket filled before I needed it. He never asked for praise, but he watched me out of the corner of his eye, waiting for that small nod that meant the work was done right, and I gave it when it was earned. Evenings were quiet. Sometimes he'd sit at the table whittling a twig into nothing while I mended clothes, the sound of the knife on wood steady, grounding. I didn't push him to speak, didn't fill the air with questions. There was something about his silence that felt less like absence and more like a space he was building carefully, piece by piece, into something that might one day be trust. It wasn't lost on me that I was doing the same. The cabin had been nothing but walls and a roof since my boy died. Now there was another heartbeat under it. I didn't know yet if that meant it was home again, but I knew this much. We were both still here, and for now, that was enough. It was near the end of the first week when the quiet between us shifted, not by much, but enough for me to notice. I'd been at the stove, pouring coffee, steam curling into the dim light, when I said, almost without planning it, "You're not a burden." I didn't look at him. Sometimes words land better when you don't aim them. For a moment, nothing. Then low and rough came, "I can fix the gate." His voice was dry, like it had been kept in a box too long. I didn't turn, didn't let the weight of the moment pull at it. "Then fix it," I said, and kept pouring. That was the first time he'd chosen to speak to me, and it came not as an explanation, not as thanks, but as an offer, a way to prove his worth without asking permission to stay. 2 days later, the mule stepped on a nail. I cursed under my breath, crouching to check the hoof, and before I could shift, the boy was there, holding the animal steady, murmuring something low enough that I couldn't quite catch the words. The mule twitched, tested him once, then settled. I saw the way his hands moved, sure, gentle, like he'd been doing it for years. After that, his words came in drops. A yes when I asked if the firewood was stacked, and "I'll do it" when the chicken feed needed hauling. He never said more than was necessary, and I didn't push for more. But something in his posture changed, the lines in his shoulders easing, his steps a little heavier on the porch boards, like he was testing how it felt to take up space again. One night, I passed his room and saw him lying down for the first time, boots set neatly beside the bed. It struck me harder than I expected, not because it meant he trusted me completely, but because it meant he trusted the night enough to let himself rest. I thought about asking, in those moments by the stove, or while we worked the fence line, what his life had been before Red Hollow, but the questions stayed behind my teeth. I've learned that truth comes when it's ready, not when you demand it. He was already working harder than any boy his age should have to, and not because I told him to. If I turned my back for a moment, I'd find him mending a tool handle, sweeping the porch, pulling burrs from the mule's tail. It wasn't obedience so much as an instinct, to keep moving, keep proving, keep from falling still long enough for the past to catch him. I knew that feeling better than I wanted to admit. I'd kept myself busy after my boy died for the same reason. Busy meant you didn't have to listen to the echo of what was missing. Sometimes, as I watched him work, I wondered if we were both trying to fill the same kind of empty, just from different ends of it. And maybe that was why I didn't push him to talk. Words can be sharp when you're not ready to hold them, and he'd already carried enough cuts for one lifetime. What I could give him instead was steadiness, a place where the ground didn't shift under him. So I nodded when he did a job right and let the silence carry us when there was nothing to say. We were building something in that quiet, whether we named it or not, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like the cabin was breathing again. It was a Tuesday when I decided it couldn't wait any longer. The flour tin was down to a dusting, the coffee canister gave off nothing but the rattle of the spoon, and the last sack of feed for the mule was already half gone. I'd been putting off the trip into Red Hollow, telling myself it could wait another day, but I knew it was just my dislike for the place. Still, a person can't run a homestead on good intentions. I planned to make it quick, ride in, get what I needed, ride out again. I hadn't thought to bring him. I was cinching the saddle when I heard boots in the dirt behind me. When I turned, there he was, the smaller saddlebag over his shoulder, like he'd been waiting for me to decide and had simply made the decision himself. He didn't say a word, just stood there, steady-eyed, not asking permission. I didn't question it. Some choices don't need to be explained. I just handed him the bag and swung into the saddle. He climbed up behind me, careful with his hands, gripping the back of the saddle instead of my coat. The ride-in was quiet, but it wasn't the same silence we'd shared when I first brought him from town. Back then, the quiet was all guarded edges and long distances. Now, it was settled, as if the road itself made space for the two of us. The sky stretched wide and pale, the sun riding low enough to cast long shadows over the grass. The sound of the mule's hooves in the dirt, the creak of leather, the faint rush of wind, it all fell into a rhythm that didn't need words. By the time the town came into view, I could feel it. That subtle shift in the air that comes when you know people are watching. The same men leaned against the saloon rail, eyes narrowed against the light. A woman crossing the street slowed her steps just enough to glance our way. In a place like Red Hollow, eyes follow you for two reasons, curiosity or trouble. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. We tied the mule outside the general store, and I pushed the door open to let us in. Inside, the cool air smelled faintly of flour and old coffee. Mr. Tallow looked up from behind the counter, his expression polite enough, but there was something guarded in it. He nodded at me, then let his gaze shift to the boy. "He yours?" he asked. I set my list on the counter. "Flour, coffee, seed if you've got it, mule feed too." He scratched the back of his neck, eyes flicking toward Eli again. "Boy working the place now, huh?" I met his look evenly. "He does what needs doing." Then I added, slow enough to leave no room for misunderstanding, "He stays." It wasn't a threat, wasn't even a warning, but I meant it to land as final. Whatever people thought they knew about where the boy had come from or what he was worth, they needed to know he wasn't passing through here like some piece of stock changing hands. He was here because I'd chosen it, and that was the end of it. Tallow's mouth twitched into something that might have been agreement or just discomfort, but he didn't press. He muttered something about checking the back, and I felt the boy go still beside me. It wasn't the same kind of stillness he'd had that first week, the braced, watchful kind, but the kind that listens closely, the kind that tries to understand whether the ground under his feet has just settled or shifted again. We finished our business without another word about it. The mule was loaded, the sun lower in the sky, casting the road home in a soft gold that made the dust shimmer. The ride out of town was just as quiet as the one in, but it felt heavier now, like something had been left behind in that store along with the coin. Halfway home, he spoke. "Why'd you bring me?" The question was soft, not a challenge, but there was weight in it. It wasn't about this trip, it was about all of it. The ride from Red Hollow that first day, the meals, the bed by the window. It was about whether he belonged here, or if I was just keeping him until I thought of something else to do with him. I let the mule take a few slow steps before answering. "Because it's your business too." I didn't look back at him, but I didn't need to. The words hung between us, and I felt them land. He didn't reply, but the air seemed to ease. His shoulders, always drawn a little too tight, softened just enough to notice. I could have told him more. I could have told him I'd traded the last thing I had of my boy to bring him away from that post. I could have told him he'd already earned his place here a dozen times over, not by the work he did, but by the simple fact that he stayed. But some truths grow better when they're given time, and I've learned not to rush them. As we rode on, the horizon stretched ahead, the land opening wide and empty, the kind of empty that holds room for whatever you're willing to build in it. I glanced back once, just for a moment. He wasn't watching me. He was looking out over the grass, the same way I did when I first came to this place, measuring it against something inside himself. Maybe he was wondering if it could be his. Maybe, in a way, it already was. It was a cooler day when we went back into Red Hollow, the kind of weather that let the air move without burning your lungs. I hadn't planned another trip so soon, but a wire had come in about fencing I'd ordered weeks back, and if I didn't collect it now, someone else would lay claim. I didn't like the idea of leaving the homestead untended, but I liked the idea of losing that wire even less. He asked to come with me. Didn't say why, and I didn't ask. There's a way he has of deciding things now, quiet but certain, and I've learned to let it stand. The ride was uneventful. A breeze skated low over the plains, bending the tall grass in slow, rolling waves. He sat the mule steady, not gripping so tightly as before, not leaning away from me like those first trips. He'd grown into the space behind me, and though he didn't say much, I could feel the difference in the way he carried himself. When we stepped into the store, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar from a crate recently opened. Mr. Tallow looked up from his ledger and nodded. "Miss Granger," he said. "You're just in time. Came in yesterday." He stepped toward the back to fetch the wire. That's when I heard the boots, heavy, deliberate, slow enough to mean trouble. A voice followed, one I remembered all too well. "Look what the wind dragged back." I didn't turn right away. I wanted to see his reflection first in the glass jar of penny candy on the counter. Rusk, cleaner than I'd ever seen him, but not clean in the ways that counted. His coat was brushed, his hair slicked back, but the smile pulling at his mouth was the same mean curve it had always been. "Well, I'll be," he said, his eyes finding Eli. "Didn't think you'd last more than a week out there, kid. What's she got you doing, huh? Milking chickens?" Eli said nothing. His hands hung loose at his sides, but I noticed the way his shoulders squared, the way his jaw set. I stepped forward, putting myself between them. "You got business here?" Rusk lifted his hands, all false innocence. "Just saying hello, against the law to greet a boy I used to know." "You didn't know him," I said, my voice even. "You owned him." The room went still. The shopkeeper stopped counting coins. A woman near the back shelf moved toward the door, eyes lowered. Rusk chuckled, slow and oily. "He was payment. Man's got to honor a debt, don't he? Besides, I didn't lay a hand on him." "You let others try," I said. His smile twitched. "Careful, widow. People start thinking you're emotional." "I've buried a husband and a son," I said, stepping in closer. "You think I'm scared of a drunk with soft hands?" He shifted, like he might close the distance, but before I could move, Eli stepped forward, not behind me, not beside me, but between us. It was quick, instinctive. His chest was squared, chin up, his hand brushing the pocket where I knew he kept the knife. Not drawn, but not hidden either. Something flickered across Rusk's face then. He looked into Eli's eyes and saw what I'd been seeing for weeks now. Not the tired, half-broken boy tied to a post, but someone who knew where he stood and wasn't about to be moved. "You'll regret wasting your coin, woman," Rusk muttered. "No," I said, "I won't." He spat on the floor, the sound sharp in the quiet, then turned and pushed out the door. "No place for charity in a place like this," he threw over his shoulder, but his voice didn't have the bite it used to. The silence stayed behind him for a few moments, like the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Eli stood still, breathing deep, his eyes on me like he was bracing for a scolding or a warning. I gave neither. I just nodded once. "Let's go." We rode out of town with the wire lashed to the mule. He didn't speak the whole way home, but I could feel the charge in the air between us, not tense, just alive. That night, after supper, he patched the east fence without being asked. Later, as we sat by the fire, I said, "You handled yourself." For a moment he didn't answer. Then, quiet, he said, "Thought maybe he'd take me back." He didn't. A pause, then, I'm not going anywhere." I didn't answer, but I slid half a biscuit from my plate to his. He took it, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw him eat without keeping one eye on the door, and for the first time in a long while, I slept straight through the night. The storm rolled in from the east fast and low, the kind that makes the air smell of iron before the first drop hits. By late afternoon, the clouds had sunk so heavy over the ridge, it felt like the sky was pressing down on the cabin. The wind picked up first, rattling the shutters, then the rain came, slanting hard against the windows. Lightning flashed so close it painted the room white for a heartbeat before the thunder shook it. I just checked the latch on the door when I realized he wasn't inside. I stepped onto the porch and saw him through the blur of rain, out by the gate, wrestling with the chain before the wind could tear it open. By the time he made it back, he was soaked through, hair plastered to his face, water dripping from his sleeves to the floorboards. "You're dripping all over the place," I said, but the words came out softer than I meant. His shoulders were hunched against the cold, his hands trembling just enough to notice. "I'm fine," he muttered, but it didn't have the ring of truth. "You're not," I told him, pulling the towel from its peg and pressing it into his hands. He tried to take off his coat, but the wet cloth clung to him, so I helped, my fingers brushing cold skin beneath. "Change," I said, stepping back to give him space. "Sit by the stove before you catch something." He didn't argue, just nodded and disappeared into the small room. When he came back, he had the blanket I'd left on the back of his chair wrapped tight around him, the ends tucked under his arms. He sank into the seat nearest the fire, pulling his knees up a little, like he was still holding the storm at bay. For a while, we didn't speak. The sound of the rain softened from its earlier fury, settling into a steady patter. The fire hissed as the wet wood stacked near the hearth dried out. It was the kind of quiet that isn't empty, but full of things neither of you are quite ready to say. Then he spoke. "You were going to give him your brooch, weren't you?" I didn't have to ask who he meant. I kept my eyes on the flames. "I did." His gaze didn't waver. "It's the only thing you kept of your son." The words caught somewhere deep, but I kept my voice steady. "It's just silver. What mattered is gone already." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the pocket of the coat hanging on the back of his chair. His hand came out with a thin strip of faded red cloth, frayed at the edges, the weave worn smooth from being handled too much. He set it on the floor between us, right in the space where the firelight caught it. "She gave me this," he said quietly. "My mother, before she left. It was part of her dress." I didn't reach for it, and he didn't offer it. We just looked at it sitting there, not as a thing to be traded or claimed, but as proof. Proof that once someone had held us close enough to leave something behind. The rain ticked steady against the roof. The wind had dropped to a low hum along the eaves, and I could feel the weight of the day loosening its hold. He cleared his throat, his eyes still on the strip of cloth. "You think I could stay? Not just till winter?" I looked at him then, really looked. His hair was still damp, curling in little wisps near his temples. The blanket was pulled snug around him, but there was nothing in his posture of the boy I'd untied from the post in Red Hollow. He didn't look like he was waiting for me to decide if he could be here. He was asking if I'd already decided. "You're already here," I said. He held my gaze for a long moment, as if measuring the truth in it, then leaned back in his chair. The blanket slipped just enough for the heat of the fire to reach his skin. He didn't smile, not exactly, but I saw something ease in his face. I'd thought there were doors in me that would stay shut forever, places I didn't have the strength to open after my boy died. But that night, sitting across from him with the fire low and the storm easing outside, I felt one give way. Not all at once, but enough for the warmth to get in. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like a place I was keeping out of stubbornness. It felt like home, and not just mine. We stayed like that until the fire burned down to embers, neither of us speaking, neither of us needing to. Outside, the rain slowed to a light drizzle, the kind that carries the smell of wet earth into the air. Inside, the space between us had changed. It wasn't the guarded kind of quiet anymore. It was the settled kind, the kind that tells you you're not alone and you won't have to be again. It was the last week of October, a clear, cold morning that made the breath from the mule rise in slow, heavy clouds. Frost silvered the grass along the creek, the edges of the water already gathering a skin of ice. I was out by the hens, scattering feed, when I saw him, a lone rider coming in slow from the southern trail. The way the light caught the figure, I knew before I saw his face that this wasn't a neighbor. Eli must have seen him at the same time, because I felt him come up beside me, silent, but close enough that I could hear his breathing shift. I kept my hand resting on the gate, eyes on the rider. As he drew nearer, the details came clear. A jacket torn at the cuffs, a twitch in the mouth that spoke of nerves or need, a horse so thin it looked ready to fold. It was Clay, Eli's uncle, the man who had tied him to that post in Red Hollow like a piece of stock no one wanted. He stopped short of the fence, slid from the saddle, and tied his reins to the post as if he had every right in the world to be there. "Didn't think I'd find my way out here," he said, trying for a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Been looking." His voice was too light, like he was trying to make it sound like something other than what it was. "You lost him," I said flatly, my hands still on the gate. "You don't get to come back for what you threw away." He chuckled, dry and thin. "A boy's not something you just lose, ma'am. He's my blood." My grip on the gate didn't tighten, didn't loosen. "You sold him." The smile slipped. "I made a mistake. We all do. Thought I might make it right." I didn't answer, because it wasn't my answer to give. Eli stepped forward then, out from behind me but not past the gate, his voice steady in a way that made the air between us change. "You didn't come to make it right. You came to finish what you started." Clay's eyes flicked to him, surprised maybe at the tone, maybe at the way Eli's shoulders squared like a man, not a boy. "You think this is your place now?" he asked. "You think you belong out here playing farmer?" Eli didn't look at me for guidance. He didn't need to. "No," he said. "I know I do." Clay took a step toward the gate, and for a moment I thought Eli might reach for the knife I knew was in his pocket, but he didn't. He stood his ground, legs planted, eyes fixed on the man who'd once owned his silence. "Turn around," he said, his voice carrying clean in the cold air. I didn't move to stop him. This wasn't my fight. This was his, and I'd be damned if I took it from him. Clay hesitated, eyes darting to the rifle leaning against the porch, back to Eli's steady stance. Maybe he saw it then, the thing I'd seen slowly building in the boy over these months. He spat in the dirt. "You ain't worth a ride," he muttered, but it didn't have teeth anymore. He swung into the saddle, turned the horse, and rode off without another word, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the stillness of the frost-covered fields. We stood there until the figure disappeared over the rise. Then I turned toward the porch, and Eli followed, his eyes still on the horizon. At the steps, I stopped. "You handled that," I said. He nodded, his gaze steady. "He's not my blood anymore." "Good," I told him. "Blood's just water anyway." The words felt truer than I'd meant them to, and the pride that settled in my chest was quiet but heavy, the kind that doesn't need to be shown to be felt. We went inside, the fire still low in the stove from the morning. I poured coffee and he sat at the table, not talking, but there was a different weight in the silence now, lighter, freer. The air felt changed, as if a door had been closed for good, and whatever had been outside no longer had the right to cross the threshold. That night, we sat on the porch wrapped in old quilts, the stars coming out slow and clear above the ridge. He leaned back in the rocker, eyes on the dark line of the hills. "You think spring will come early?" he asked. I sipped my coffee. "Never does." He gave a small, real smile. "We'll be ready either way." I nodded. We didn't say anything more after that, because we didn't need to. Morning would come, chores would wait, and life, our life, would go on. The chapter with Clay was closed, and neither of us had to carry it anymore. After Clay rode off for good, the days settled into a rhythm that didn't carry the same weight they used to. There was no looking over our shoulders, no wondering if the sound of hooves on the trail meant trouble. Morning came, we rose, and the work began. The air felt different, lighter, like the walls of the cabin could finally hold peace instead of just keeping out the cold. Neighbors started calling him the Granger boy not long after, and what surprised me most was how he didn't correct them. The first time I heard it was in town, a passing comment from old Mrs. Kettering at the feed store. "That Granger boy's grown some," she'd said, as we loaded the mule. He didn't flinch, didn't glance at me for permission, just kept stacking the sacks like it was the most natural thing in the world. On the way home, I asked him if he minded. He shrugged. "Feels right enough?" That was all he said, but I caught the way he sat a little straighter in the saddle afterward. Evenings became my favorite part of the day. We'd finish supper and sit out on the porch, sometimes wrapped in quilts if the wind had a bite to it. He'd rock slow in the chair that used to belong to my husband, eyes on the tree line like he was keeping watch, not because he was afraid, but because he had someone to watch it for now. I'd sip my coffee, listen to the creak of the boards beneath us, and think about how far we'd come from that day in Red Hollow. For years, this place had been just something I kept alive, because I didn't know what else to do. The chores, the repairs, the planting and the harvesting, it was all a way to keep from hearing the quiet that followed after you lose too much. I'd been surviving, not living, but with him here, the silence had changed. It wasn't a reminder of what was gone anymore. It was just the sound of home. He filled the space without trying to. A pair of boots by the door that weren't mine. 2 cups always set on the shelf. The tools in the shed organized in a way that made sense to him, and now to me. Firewood stacked so neatly it almost seemed a shame to use it. Little things that, when you strung them together, made the cabin feel whole again. I learned something watching him settle into this life, that belonging isn't about blood or papers or names on deeds. It's about the choice to stay and the work you put in to make staying worth it. Eli had chosen to stay long before he said the words out loud, and maybe I had too, though I didn't know it at the time. There were still hard days, of course. Fences broke, storms rolled in, animals got sick, but those things didn't carry the same edge they used to because I wasn't meeting them alone anymore. When you've got someone beside you, not in front, not behind, but beside, the weight shifts. It's still heavy, but it's shared. One night, late in the winter, we sat by the fire, the wind rattling the shutters. I was mending a tear in his shirt when he said, "You think we'll always be ready for whatever comes?" I set the needle down and thought about it. "We can't be ready for everything," I said, "but we can be ready for each other." He nodded like that was enough for him, and for me it was. If you'd told me, back in those first months after I buried my boy, that one day I'd open this door to someone new and find the house made whole again, I wouldn't have believed you. But life doesn't always come back to you the way you expect. Sometimes it comes walking up your path in worn boots, carrying nothing but the weight of its own survival, and asks, without words, if you've got room. I didn't save Eli. I gave him a place, and he did the rest. And in giving him that place, I found my own footing again. We both learned that family isn't always born into your life. Sometimes it's built, one small choice at a time, until you can't imagine the place without them. So when folks in town call him the Granger boy, I don't correct them either. He is. Not by blood, but by something stronger. And if you've walked with us through this story, if you've felt even a little of what it means to hold your ground, to choose someone and then be chosen back, I'd ask you to take a moment before you go. Like this story so it can keep traveling. Leave a comment. Tell me who stood beside you when it mattered, or who you've stood for. And if you want to hear more of these lives out here on the edge, follow along. There's always another story waiting just over the rise, another voice ready to be heard. Because that's the thing I've learned. You never know when the next stranger you meet might just be the piece that makes your house whole again.